Good evening, Canada. We need to have a deeply serious, unfiltered conversation about the future of this country. I'm not talking about the fleeting headlines that scroll across the bottom of your news screen, nor am I talking about the carefully curated talking points handed down by lobbyists in Washington or Brussels. I want to talk to you about a decision that has fundamentally altered the trajectory of our national defense, our economy, and, most importantly, our national identity. For the first time in over half a century, Ottawa has made a strategic move that suggests we are finally ready to grow up. The government's decision to acquire 88 Saab Gripen fighter jets from Sweden, explicitly rejecting the immense political and economic pressure to purchase the American Lockheed Martin F-35, is not just a procurement contract. It is not just about replacing aging CF-18s. It is a declaration of independence. It is the definitive moment where Canada decided to stop acting like a client state and start behaving like a sovereign power. If you are watching this, you are likely part of a generation that remembers a different Canada. You remember a time when this nation built things. You remember a time when our factories hummed with homegrown innovation and our industries were the envy of the Western world. And you likely remember the bitter, lingering sting of betrayal when we allowed our industrial capacity to be dismantled to please our powerful allies. That is why this story matters so much. This is not just about planes. This is about redemption. This is about reclaiming a destiny we abandoned decades ago. Let us look at the hard, uncomfortable reality of what was on the table before this decision was made. For years, the narrative pushed by the defense establishment was absolute and suffocating. Canada must buy the Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II. We were told repeatedly that it was the only option. It is a fifth-generation stealth fighter, a technological marvel, and the choice of most of our NATO partners. On the surface, sticking with the herd seemed like the safe, inevitable choice. But when you strip away the glossy marketing brochures, when you ignore the handshake photo ops, and when you look at the raw, unvarnished data, the F-35 deal begins to look less like a partnership and more like a financial and strategic trap. The initial price tag was floated at around $19 billion. That sounds like a lot, but in the world of defense procurement, anyone who has managed a budget knows that the purchase price is merely the down payment. It is the sticker price that gets you in the door. When independent defense analysts and auditors began to crunch the numbers for the full life cycle of these aircraft, factoring in the complex maintenance, the specialized fuel, the continuous software upgrades, and pilot training over a 30-year lifespan, the real cost threatened to exceed $30 billion. Let that number sink in. $30 billion. That is a figure that should make every taxpayer in this country pause and demand answers. We are talking about the single largest defense expenditure in Canadian history, a sum that surpasses the annual healthcare and education budgets of entire provinces combined. But the money, as staggering as it is, was not the ultimate deal breaker. The deal breaker was control. When a sovereign nation buys the F-35, they are effectively entering a subscription service for their own national defense. The operating software of the F-35 is a proprietary black box, owned, encrypted, and controlled entirely by the Pentagon and Lockheed Martin. Canada would not own the source code. This is a critical distinction that often gets lost in the technical jargon. If the Royal Canadian Air Force wanted to integrate a new, cutting-edge missile system developed by a European or Israeli partner, we would have to ask Washington for permission. If we wanted to update the radar software to better track a specific, new type of threat emerging in the Arctic, we would have to wait for a software update from the United States. And if Washington said no, whether for political reasons, trade disputes, or security concerns, our jets would stay exactly as they were. We would have billions of dollars of hardware that we could not fully control. Imagine buying a luxury car, but having to call the dealership every time you wanted to change the radio station, adjust the seat, or drive to a new city. Now apply that logic to national security during a global crisis. That is not sovereignty. That is a rental agreement. That is structured dependency. This is where the Swedish alternative, the Saab Gripen E, offered something radically different. Sweden is a nation that mirrors us in many ways. They are a northern people. They value neutrality and armed self-reliance. And because they understand what it means to be a smaller nation living next to a bear, they offered Canada the keys to the kingdom. The Gripen deal includes the full, unrestricted transfer of the source code. This means Canadian engineers can see every single line of programming that runs the aircraft. We can modify the software. We can rewrite the mission data files. We can integrate weapons from Europe, from Asia, or from domestic Canadian manufacturers without asking for a permission slip from a foreign capital. For a generation of Canadians aged 40 to 65 who have watched our sovereignty erode and our reliance on Washington deepen, this resonates on a visceral level. It is the difference between being a helpless passenger in your own vehicle and being the driver who decides the destination. Now let us discuss the theater of operations. This is the reality check that the F-35 lobbyists tried desperately to ignore. We are an Arctic nation. We control a vast frozen frontier that is becoming increasingly contested as the ice melts and new shipping lanes open up. The operational reality of the Canadian North is brutal, unforgiving, and unlike any other environment on Earth. We are talking about a landscape where temperatures routinely drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius. In these conditions, hydraulic fluids thicken, rubber becomes brittle, and sensitive electronics can fail. We are talking about extreme isolation, where the nearest support base might be 1,000 kilometers away across a frozen tundra. The F-35 is, without a doubt, a remarkable piece of engineering, but it is a hangar queen. It was designed to operate from massive, pristine air bases in the deserts of Nevada or the mild climates of Europe. It requires climate-controlled facilities, specialized hangars to protect its stealth coating, and armies of support staff. It needs a long, clean, perfectly paved runway. Its mission capability rates, the percentage of time the aircraft is actually ready to fly versus being stuck in repair, have been a source of constant frustration for operators, often hovering between a dismal 30% and 50%. Think about what that means for our defense. In a fleet of 10 jets stationed in the north, 5 or 6 would be grounded at any given moment, unable to launch. In a crisis, those are odds we cannot accept. The Gripen, by contrast, was bred for the blizzard. Sweden developed this fighter with a survivalist philosophy born of the Cold War. The assumption that in a Russian invasion, all major air bases would be destroyed in the first hour of combat. Therefore, the Air Force must be able to survive and fight without them. The Gripen is designed to disperse. It can take off and land on a strip of ordinary highway or a rough, snow-packed runway as short as 800 meters. Consider the strategic implication of that capability for Canada. We do not need to build multi-billion-dollar megabases in Nunavut or the Northwest Territories that act as easy, stationary targets for enemy missiles. We can operate from remote mining strips. We can utilize converted roadways. We can fly out of small regional airports that already exist. The logistical footprint is incredibly light. A team of just 6 conscript-level technicians and a single standard fuel truck can rearm and refuel a Gripen in under an hour. The pilot can even keep the engine running while they refuel, a technique known as hot pitting, in the middle of a frozen nowhere, and be back in the air patrolling the border before an adversary even knows they have landed. The readiness rates for the Gripen sit comfortably between 80% and 90%. When you need it, it flies. In the defense of our sovereign airspace, reliability is not a luxury feature. It is the only metric that actually counts. Then there is the economic argument, which is impossible for any fiscally responsible citizen to ignore. The operating cost per flight hour for the Gripen is approximately $8,000. Contrast that with the F-35, which commands an estimated $35,000 to $47,000 per hour. That is not a marginal difference. That is a 5-fold disparity. Let's translate that into real value for the Canadian taxpayer. To maintain combat proficiency, a fighter pilot needs to log about 200 flight hours a year. If they fly less, their skills degrade, and they become dangerous to themselves and then ineffective in combat. With a fleet of 88 aircraft, taking the F-35 route would cost us between $615 million and $827 million annually just to keep the pilots trained. That is nearly $1 billion a year just for gas and maintenance. The Gripen allows us to do the exact same work for roughly $140 million per year. Over a 30-year life cycle, the savings amount to between $15 and $20 billion. What could Canada do with an extra $20 billion? That is money that stays in the Treasury. That is money that can be used to build deep water ports in the Arctic, which we desperately need to assert our sovereignty. It could modernize our aging naval fleet, buying new submarines to patrol under the ice. It could invest in cyber warfare capabilities or strengthen our radar networks. By choosing the Gripen, we can effectively double our flight hours within the same budget envelope. This means our pilots will be better trained, more experienced, and more comfortable in their aircraft than their adversaries. In a world of tightening budgets and economic uncertainty, choosing the Gripen was the only act of true fiscal responsibility. But the most profound aspect of this acquisition is not what we are buying, but what we are building. This is the part of the story that should make every Canadian heart swell with a renewed sense of possibility and pride. We all live in the shadow of 1959. For those of you in the audience between 40 and 65, you grew up hearing the stories. The cancellation of the Avro Arrow is a national trauma that has been passed down through generations like a ghost story. It was the moment Canada had the world's most advanced interceptor, a plane that was decades ahead of its time, designed and built by Canadians in Malton, Ontario. And then, in one day, Black Friday, we crushed it. The government didn't just cancel the project, they ordered the prototypes destroyed. We fired 14,000 of our brightest minds overnight. We watched them pack their bags and move south to the United States. Those Canadian engineers went on to become the pillars of NASA. They helped put American astronauts on the moon, while our own aerospace ambitions were left to wither and die. It was a self-inflicted wound that taught us a painful, enduring lesson. Dependence on others leads to the death of domestic innovation. For 60 years, we became a branch plant economy, buying American gear and assembling American designs, always the junior partner, never the architect. The deal with Saab is our chance, perhaps our last chance, to heal that wound. This is not a simple off-the-shelf purchase. It is a comprehensive technology transfer partnership. The agreement stipulates that the final assembly of these 88 jets will take place on Canadian soil. The maintenance and overhaul will be managed by Canadian firms. The software will be updated by Canadian programmers in Ottawa and Waterloo. Even more significantly, Rolls-Royce has explicitly committed to manufacturing the engines for these jets right here in Canada. Facilities in Montreal and Winnipeg are set to be upgraded into world-class production hubs for next-generation propulsion. We are not just creating assembly line jobs, we are creating a knowledge economy. Economic estimates suggest this program will generate up to 15,000 direct and indirect jobs over the next decade. These are high-paying, stable, unionized careers for engineers, mechanics, designers, and technologists. This deal ensures that the intellectual property and the industrial muscle required to defend our skies reside here, at home. We are moving from being a consumer of defense technology back to being a producer. We are telling our young engineering graduates that they do not need to move to California, Texas, or Seattle to work on the cutting edge of aerospace. They can build the future in Manitoba, in Quebec, and in Ontario. This decision also signals a sophisticated, mature shift in our foreign policy. For decades, our defense strategy was essentially to hold on to the coattails of the United States. We assumed that if we bought American, we would be safe. But the world is changing. The geopolitical landscape is fracturing. The Gripen purchase aligns us with a new, pragmatic Northern alliance. Look at the map. Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Denmark face the exact same geopolitical threats and environmental challenges that we do. They share the same concern about an aggressive Russia in the high north. By operating the same or similar platforms as our Nordic neighbors, we are building a coalition of the capable. We are looking at a future of shared training exercises where Canadian pilots fly seamlessly alongside Swedish and Finnish counterparts. We are looking at integrated supply chains, where a spare part manufactured in Winnipeg can be used to fix a jet in Stockholm. We are developing a common doctrine for Arctic warfare that is not dictated by a superpower that focuses on global projection, but by nations that focus on territorial defense. This creates a defense network that is robust, diversified, and resilient. We are still a proud founding member of NATO. We are still a close partner of the United States and NORAD. But we are finally coming to the table as an equal with our own unique capabilities, not just as a junior partner asking for protection. We are adding value to the alliance by securing the northern flank with the right tool for the job. We must also look at the warning signs from our friends in Europe who chose differently. We must learn from their mistakes. Look at Switzerland. In 2022, the Swiss government signed up for the F-35 with an initial cost estimate of 5 billion Swiss francs. It was sold to the public as the cheapest option. By 2024, the costs had already ballooned to over 8 billion, and the delivery dates were slipping further into the future. But the money was only half the problem. The Swiss soon discovered that their sovereignty was compromised. Reports emerged that they could not deploy the aircraft for certain specific missions or share critical data with non-US allies without receiving explicit permission from Washington. When they wanted to integrate European-made missiles, they were blocked. Switzerland found out the hard way that they had not bought a fighter jet. They had bought a geopolitical leash. They had outsourced their security decision-making. Canada has looked at that example and chosen a different path. We have chosen the path of resilience. We have chosen the path where we hold the codes, we make the decisions, and we control the timeline. However, we cannot be naive. We must be vigilant. This decision, as historic as it is, will face immense challenges. There will be relentless pressure from lobbyists in DC to reverse course. There will be whispers in diplomatic circles about interoperability issues, a common scare tactic used to enforce conformity. There will be future governments perhaps facing a recession that might be tempted to cut corners on the industrial commitments to save a few dollars in the short term. This is where you come in. This is where the citizens of Canada must become the guardians of this policy. The 15,000 jobs, the engine plants in Montreal and Winnipeg, the sovereign control over our Arctic skies, These are not guaranteed by ink on a paper contract. They are guaranteed by the political will of the Canadian people. We must hold our leaders accountable. We must ensure that every single promised job materializes. We must demand that the technology transfer is complete and transparent. We must never again allow our aerospace sector to atrophy as we did after the Avro Aero cancellation. We must watch the implementation of this deal like hawks. The choice between the F-35 and the Gripen was never just about stealth capabilities versus ruggedness. It was never just about sensors versus speed. It was a philosophical choice between the past and the future. The F-35 represented the old way. Expensive, dependent, centralized, and controlled by others. It represented a Canada that was content to be a follower. The Gripen represents the new Canada, pragmatic, resilient, independent, and confident in its own abilities. We have chosen to prioritize the practical reality of our geography over the theoretical glamour of the showroom floor. We have chosen to invest in our own workers, our own middle class, rather than subsidizing the military-industrial complex of another nation. We have chosen to secure our northern sovereignty with a fleet that can actually fly when the temperature hits -40 and the runways are covered in ice. This is a new era for the Royal Canadian Air Force and a new era for Canadian industry. It is a story of a nation reclaiming its self-respect. It is a story that proves we can make hard decisions that put Canadian interests first, second, and third. Imagine the future 10 years from now. Imagine a young engineer in Montreal designing the next software update for our fleet. Imagine a technician in the Northwest Territories refueling a jet on a remote highway in the dead of winter, knowing that the engine humming beside him was built in Winnipeg. Imagine the roar of those engines patrolling the Beaufort Sea, sending a clear, undeniable message to the world that the Canadian Arctic is protected by Canadians using Canadian know-how. That is the future we have bought. That is the value of this deal. It is about more than steel and avionics. It is about national maturity. I want to thank you for taking the time to understand the depth and the nuance of this issue. It is rare to find a community that cares so deeply about the strategic future of our country, beyond the sound bites. If you agree that Canada made the right choice by prioritizing sovereignty and our own industrial power, please let me know. Or if you have concerns about how this independent path will play out with our relationship with the United States, I want to hear that too. Please leave a comment below. A simple "thank you for this analysis" goes a long way in helping us keep this conversation going and signals to the algorithm that Canadians care about serious content. But I am truly interested in your perspective. Do you think this marks the return of Canada's aerospace glory days? Or do we still have a long way to go? Let's talk about it in the comments. Thank you for watching, thank you for your engagement, and thank you for caring about a strong, independent Canada.